Thank you. It's so nice to be back home. And this introduction was the nicest introduction ever. So Ryan emailed me to ask for personal details. I didn't know what to say. And everything I said went in there, so hopefully it's okay. So Patricia, I ran into Patricia in the corridor today, and she reminded me of one more thing that she did other than inspiring me. So my mother was completely disappointed when I decided to switch from engineering to sociology. I had gotten to Princeton, but that wasn't good enough. So anyway, so she came here within 24 hours of receiving the news that I would do sociology, and I was kind of very distraught. She stayed here for 2 weeks, and Patricia actually offered to talk to her and to convince her, which we didn't have to do in the end, but yeah, thank you. So today I'm going to talk about a book project. So I have a contract with Princeton University Press, incidentally. And so this is a book project that I've been working on for a couple of years, and now I have a complete draft. But this summer will be about revising the book. And believe it or not, I'm still working through a lot of the things, the framing, the argument, the evidence that I'm using. And this will be the last talk that I'll give before the book will be done. So hopefully it will be kind of one kind of last push, and the thoughts that you'll provide will be very helpful in getting there. So the book is based on Mexican migration project data, many of you are familiar with, that's been collected by Doug Massey and researchers in Mexico for over 30 years now. And I've also done some qualitative work in Mexico. 3 summers ago, we went and interviewed about 150 families with migrants and families without any migrants in different places in central western Mexico. So the book is combining these 2 sources of information to help us make sense of the last 50 years of Mexico-U.S. migration. So today I'll just focus on the quantitative part and try to give you the basic idea. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to talk about the other pieces of evidence as well. So I don't have a pocket, that's why this is creating a problem. So basically, I'll start with a quote from a migrant. So we ended up each interview by asking migrants. So we collected life histories from migrants in our qualitative data collection. But at the very end, we asked people about migration and why do you think people migrate in general? So that was the last thing. And one person that we talked to said, well, every person is a different world. They think differently. So this actually summarizes the argument of the book. Migrants actually have been coming here for different reasons. And these reasons are more or less structurally induced by what's going on in Mexico and what's going on in the United States. So if we look at Mexican-born people in the U.S. today, there are about 12 million. Half of them are undocumented. And the questions that I'm asking in the book are basically, who are these migrants and what brings them here? And the point that I'm making is there's really no single answer to these questions. Different conditions become salient in people's lives under different, larger circumstances. So the goal is to understand that. So, but if we look at the larger stream of the Mexican flow to the U.S., we can actually see these changes in some of the characteristics. For example, in the 1970s, 75% of migrants coming to the U.S. were men. In the 1990s, the share of men dropped to about 65%. So it looked like the flow was going for gender parity. But then the share of men increased again in the 2000s to the same level that it was before, about 73%. Now in the 1970s, there were 5 states that supplied 2/3 of all migrants to the U.S. in Mexico. So these states were all located in the Central West. This region had been connected to the U.S. early on with railroads and had become kind of a major migrant sending area in Mexico. But then in the 1990s, the share of migrants coming from these regions basically dropped off half, and in 2000 to a quarter. So the migrant flow was diversifying in its origins in Mexico, and urban stream, people from cities like Mexico City or Tijuana, was joining the mostly rural migrants of the earlier decades. And then the migrant stream also diversified in the places that it landed in the U.S. So in the 1970s, again, almost 90% of migrants went to just 3 states, California, Texas, Illinois. But then in the 1990s, the share of migrants to these states dropped to 75%, and then in 2000, about a half. So what explains these changes? What are the origins of these shifts? Or, more generally, we can ask, what actually determines who migrates from Mexico to the U.S.? Now, There's actually big literature in multiple disciplines covering this question, but if you actually sort through these ideas and focus on individual motivations or family motivations for migration, there are three key ideas in the literature. So these ideas connect migration either to individual desires to maximize income, so people want to improve their economic opportunities, that's why they move. Some theories talk about family strategies, how family has to come together to decide on the goals, and usually the goal in migration is to diversify risks to income. And this especially applies in developing economies like Mexico, where there's a lot of volatility and few kind of formal markets or mechanisms to manage it. And then the other big idea is by our very own Black Massey, migration is also about social ties to former or current migrants. So eventually, it may be disconnected from economic incentives. So these are the basic theories on individual level motivations. And as you might guess, they have different macro level necessary conditions for that to occur. So for individuals to be able to maximize income by migrating, we need to have some employment or wage differentials between countries. And that's kind of a basic necessary condition. If migration is about risk diversification, you need to have severe risk in the sending community or uncertainty that cannot be managed through regular markets or insurance schemes. And if you're talking about the importance of social ties, you need to have a path flow. So migration is about this kind of path dependence over time. Now, there are other ideas that work mostly at the macro level. So they don't have predictions at the micro level on who will migrate, but they do talk about why migration happens. So one big idea is the segmented labor markets idea. And here, the basic intuition is in every advanced economy, there's a dual structure to the labor market, there's a capital-intensive sector, labor-intensive sector, and natives don't want to work in labor-intensive, low-paying jobs, so you recruit migrants for that. And once you recruit migrants, certain jobs become labeled as immigrant jobs, natives want to work in them less, so you have created this persistent demand for migration. And the other big idea is this world systems or globalization idea. Countries are now connected through trade or money flows, and when money flows from the U.S. to Mexico, that changes the local structure, disrupts local economies, and then creates a population that's familiar with the institutions of the U.S. So that creates the mobility between the two countries. Again, these are macro level ideas, and I'm going to focus mostly on micro level motivations today. Now, most of the literature has been concerned with trying to kind of sort out which of these ideas is most relevant in different settings. For example, the Mexico-U.S. migration, several papers by Dr. Massey suggest that the neoclassical model is not that predictive, but the new economics model, the model about risk diversification or cumulative causation, where it's about social ties, seem more relevant. So what I'm trying to do here is similar, but I'm asking the question slightly differently. I'm asking when and for whom is each theory most relevant? And the argument that I'm making is that migrants might have different reasons for coming to the U.S., and these different personal reasons might become more or less salient under different circumstances. Now, the big question, of course, is methodological here. How do we discover these different reasons that bring Mexicans to the U.S.? In other words, I'm talking about some sort of causal heterogeneity, but how do we actually identify it? Now, I'll step back here and just try to give the basic intuition behind the method that I'm using. So basically, in social sciences, we're typically interested in identifying general trends or patterns. And the way we do it is we take a typical case, the most typical case, like the white square here, and we study the path that led it to an outcome, Y. But if we look into our sample, we can actually see different cases, like the circle or a triangle, that reach the same outcome, which is to migrate in my case, but through very different pathways. And these cases might be very small in number, but still important for us to understand the process that leads to the outcome. So the question is, how do we identify these different pathways, these different arrows? So this is what I do. I start by looking at my population and trying to come up with the circles, triangles, and the squares first. So I fix the outcome, and I study only the migrants. So this is selecting on the dependent variable. I create a pool of first-time migrants to the U.S. over the past 45 years using the MMP data. Then I search for different groups among them. Now, I'm defining these groups based on shared configurations of attributes. And the big assumption that I'm making here is that individuals with similar attributes will face similar opportunity structures. So if I'm someone, I'm a farmer, an educated farmer in a poor rural community, the conditions I'll face will be similar to those who are like me, but they can be very different from someone who's educated, living in the big city, working in an office job. So that's the basic intuition. And we actually make these assumptions quite often in the social sciences when we separate our samples across known dimensions like gender, men and women, we estimate different models, blacks and whites, we estimate different models, and the idea is that the structures, the opportunity structures for these groups might be different. So this is a similar approach. The only difference is I'm not singling out one or two dimensions, but I'm looking at multiple dimensions at the same time, and I'm discovering these groups inductively from the data in the multi-dimensional space. And then, I don't know why these are all one. They're not. They're all equally important. So then, once I've selected, once I've identified the groups, now this is where I try to address the selection of the dependent variable thing. I try to identify the conditions that set apart each migrant group from the other migrant groups, as well as from the non-migrants. Are these groups really different from each other? Are they being really selected differently from the overall population? Now, this strategy basically amounts to asking three related questions. Who migrates? This is the first question we're going to look at. When? And then why? Now, the data I'm using, as I said, is the Mexican Migration Project, headed by Doug Massey. And the project has been going on for several decades. So the strategy of this project is basically go to a few communities each year and randomly select 200 households and collect retrospective information on everyone in those households. And they have done 143 communities until now. I've heard 150 sample is just coming out with this data, this analysis based on the iteration before that, 143 communities. And the communities actually have kind of the geographic reach. They kind of are in 24 states out of 31 in Mexico. And basically I use the retrospective information on household members to reconstruct the characteristics of each person on their first trip to the United States. So if I meet someone who's migrated in 1970, that's where I take back all the characteristics. And I want to capture people before they migrate to prevent the endogeneity issue, because migration changes a lot of things about people. So if I study repeated trips, it all gets confounded. So I want to kind of get at the situation that made them migrate in the first place. So in the end, my sample contains about 20,000 migrants. They're all observed during their first trip to the U.S., which occurs sometime between 1965 and 2000. And the method I'm using is, I start with cluster analysis. Basically, this is a method to discover groups with similar attributes in the data. So the method basically discovers categories, first identifies categories based on several attributes, and then places individuals in those categories. And it's an inductive method, and it's quite intuitive, and actually easy if you have a few dimensions. You could even do it manually. So if you have education and income, and if your sample looks something like this, where people cluster around two kind of combinations, low education, low income, high education, high income, you can immediately say, well, there are two groups in my data. But it becomes very complicated when you have several dimensions. It becomes impossible for a human to do, and you need computational algorithms for that. But then the computational algorithms cannot do it automatically, so it requires input from you as well. So how does it work? I'll go over this very briefly. If there's any interest, I'm happy to discuss the details. So the first thing you do, like in any modeling effort, you choose and scale the relevant attributes. So the scaling thing is interesting. Choosing the relevant attributes is like in regression. So you basically look at the literature and things that are related to migration. All of them are included here. Things like person's age, education, the kind of household, life stage, whether they're married or not, and then what kind of community they live in, do they own any assets, all of these socioeconomic and demographic characteristics, and nothing else. Many of my attributes are binary, and actually clustering is very sensitive to scaling of your variables. So you need to make sure they're all measured on the same scale. So I dichotomize the things that were not measured on the binary scale, so everything is 0, 1. Then you need to choose an algorithm. And that step actually does not make much of a difference. Most algorithms produce comparable results. And here I went with a generic k-means algorithm. This is the simplest algorithm that makes no assumptions about the data structure. So there are alternative models that either assume a probability distribution of the data or like assume a hierarchical structure of your groupings. K-means does none of that. The most crucial stage is step number 3, where you choose a similarity measure. So if I know all your attributes, and I have all my attributes, how do I determine how different or similar we are? And there are many alternatives here. But I want to go with the simplest measure possible so that I could see what adding or taking out a variable or changing the categorization was doing to the data. So the measure that I'm using is called the city block distance. So basically, imagine I have 20 attributes, all 0, 1, and you have 20 attributes. I difference us on each attribute, take the absolute value and sum it up. It's a very simple measure. If we're same on everything, our distance is 0. If we're different on everything, our distance is the maximum, or is the number of attributes that I have. And then the final step is the algorithm cannot tell you how many groups there are in your data. It will discover groups as long as you tell it, I have 2 groups and 3 groups or 4 groups. And there's no way of knowing this in advance. And you use some sort of model selection procedure here to determine the optimum number. And they call it cluster validation measures. The problem is, with a lot of computer science literature, there are like hundreds of validation measures that people have come up with that fits different purposes because computer science is developed in such an ad hoc manner most of the time. So here I tried to use 5 or 6 very popular ones that look at kind of different criteria, how well separated your groupings are, so on and so forth. But again, this is not kind of such a precise thing. You actually need to look at your groupings and make sure that they make sense to you substantively. You can divide the data in any way that you want, but in the end, you want to learn something from it by using that categorization. So that's what I mean by you can use these measures, but you also have to provide your own input into it. So here, the 4-cluster solutions seem to be either optimal or reasonable for most of the measures that I've used. So I went with that. And the 4-cluster solution also gave kind of a uniform distribution across groupings. And most importantly, the 4-cluster solution made sense with the external validation measures that I was using, or techniques. So the first question, who migrates? So I did the clustering, came up with 4 groups. What do they look like? So cluster 1, almost everyone in this group is a male, 90% men. The modal education is no education. 60% of them have less than primary schooling. The rest, 30% have only primary school education. So really low levels of education. No land or property, really poor, with no possessions. And they live in poor rural communities, and almost all of them come from central western Mexico. So this is, if you will, the stereotypical Mexican migrant that we think about, uneducated, poor from rural communities in the Central West. Now, this is based on the complete data that I have, but a portion of the NMP is more detailed. So out of 20,000, for 5,000 household heads and spouses, we actually have a lot more information over time. So if we look at that partial data to get more insight into what this group looks like, you can actually see almost everyone here is a household head. So they're the head of a young family. They might have a young child or just married. They're the first to migrate in their family, in the entire family. And then their typical behavior is to send remittances or bring back savings. And many of them, majority of them, actually return to Mexico after their first trip. So I was referring to these groups as cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3, and then I gave several talks and people said they got sick of hearing the word cluster, so I'm giving them names now. So I'm calling this the pioneer group. If you come up with ideas for names, that would be really helpful because I'm not sure these names are perfect. So the second group. Second group is similar in some ways. Again, we have a majority of men, 80%, slightly more educated. So the modal education is primary education. The thing that sets them apart is that their family owns a property and even a business on land. So they're likely to come from wealthier families, relatively speaking. They're still living in poor rural communities in central western Mexico. If we look at the partial data, we see that almost all of them are younger sons in the household. and they're single, and they're extremely young. So about 70% are between the ages of 15 and 19, really teenagers. And then they migrate typically after a sibling or a parent. So to me, because the younger sons are migrating, and the household head typically stays back, taking care of the property or land, this looks more like a family arrangement. And I call this group the followers to suggest that they're following siblings or parents who've migrated before them, but they're also following family orders in a way. So I'll talk more about this later on. So young, relatively wealthy sons. So the third group is the majority of women. About 70% are women, some education, they own property. What sets them apart is they have multiple migrants in their family. So either a husband or a father has migrated before them and currently in the U.S. when they are migrating. They're again coming from these traditional migrant standing areas that are rural, located in the Central West. Again, the partial data tells us about their status in the household, daughters or spouses. They're married, almost all of them are married, and they're migrating again after a sibling or a parent. And they're the most likely to settle in the U.S., most likely to be legalized across all migrant groups, and they're most likely to be unemployed in the U.S. So I call them family and friends, suggesting that their migration is probably motivated to join family members here rather than to work in the United States. And then the final group, to me, this is still kind of a surprising group. That gave me some ideas about what might be pushing this group to the U.S. But they're again men, but they're much more educated than everyone else. And by much more educated, I don't mean college or PhDs, but middle or high school education. They're more educated than an average Mexican. And they live in urban communities. That's very different from the three groups. And they don't come from the Central West, but mostly from border, central or southeastern Mexico. So we can actually see that in this map. So the dark gray states here are the ones that contain a high share of cluster 1 migrants, the pioneers. And they're in the Central West. And then the same for cluster 2, the younger sons. Same for cluster 3, and then changes completely for this last cluster. Suddenly, people move up to the border, and then some to the Central West. Now, if we look at the partial data, they could be they're equally likely to be sons or household heads, and they're also likely to be first to migrate in the family. They're coming from these urban regions where migration is not typical. And I call this group the urbanites because this is the thing that stands out to me most, that they're coming from urban regions that did not send many migrants to the U.S. So we have this answer to the question of who migrates. The second question we're asking is when do they migrate? Now, this is interesting, right? So we didn't include any time varying characteristics here. It's only personal attributes. So we have no kind of prior reason to expect these migrants to cluster in different time periods. But they actually do very strongly. So if we look at the pioneers, the y-axis shows the percentage of pioneers in the total migrant stream. Another way to look at this as a share of the entire residents in the area that are settling now, and the results are identical. It's just easier to talk about percentage. So in the 1960s, about 70% of first-time migrants coming to the U.S. fell into this category. A clear majority. Most migrants coming then were uneducated, from poor rural areas, and from poor families. But the share of this group in the migrant stream dropped consistently, and now it's a minority. If we look at the second group, a different kind of signature. So this group was about 10-15% of total migrants in the 1960s. It increased and became like the majority in the mid-1980s. About half of all first-time migrants coming to the U.S. fell into this category then, but then it declined with like small peaks around early 1990s. Now again, it's a small group compared to the rest. The third group, family and friends, mostly women, daughters. Here we see a consistent increase, which makes sense. As more migrants come here, more can bring their family members. But then pay attention to what happens in early 1990s. There's a sudden jump in the share of this group. It jumps from 20% to 40% in a few years. So there's a sudden increase, and then, again, a consistent, slow increase after that. And the urbanites, the group I found was surprising, small share of migrants in the 60s, 70s, 80s, but then in the early 90s, this group starts to climb up and becomes the majority in 2010. So most migrants then are coming from urban regions. Now, we can see that each group is present in each year, and then but to different degrees. So the pioneers actually concentrate in the 1970s, the followers, the second group, become the majority in the 1980s, family and friends, mostly women, basically experience this sudden jump in the 1990s, and the urbanites become the majority in the early 1990s. Now the big question is, why? Why is it that each migrant group becoming prevalent in a particular period? Now, before I answer this question, I kind of want to point out one thing. We see that different groups are observed in different periods, right? So this kind of raises a question about differences we attributed to these groups. So we said that pioneers, for example, were less educated and urbanites were more educated. But then most pioneers are observed in the 1960s and 70s and most urbanites in the 1990s. And there's a secular increase in education in Mexico over time. So am I just capturing these differences and thinking that I have different groups, or are these differences real? And there are many models at the back end of the paper, but I'm trying to come up with ways of showing it with pictures, and hopefully it works. So basically this shows the average education among non-migrants in Mexico. In 1965, it was about 4 years, and it consistently increased to about 8 years in 1990. But then, if we look at the two groups that I just pointed out, the urbanites and the pioneers, the difference between them is steady. I mean, they're both increasing slightly over time, following the secular trend in Mexico, but the differences between them are stable. So the urbanite observed in the 1960s still 4 years more educated than the pioneer. In other words, these differences are kind of real. And the other way of doing that is you could do the clustering by correcting everyone for a baseline. So that also works, but it's kind of, again, hard to talk about in a talk. It's easier to talk about these absolute numbers. Again, if we look at trends in urban residents, so there's an increasing urbanization in Mexico, like in many developing countries, and it might be that we observe urbanites in later periods because more people are living in urban areas. And here, this is an interesting pattern. So we see that there's no urbanization in the MMP data, and this has to do with how MMP is sampled. The researchers obviously want to go to places where there are a lot of migrants, so rural communities are kind of oversampled. But for our purposes, that doesn't matter as long as the differences between groups are real. Again, if we look at the pioneers and urbanites, huge difference that's stable over time. Another thing that we can look at is trends in wealth. The Mexican GDP has been increasing, so we would expect people to be kind of better off in later years, and we actually see this secular trend in the number of rooms owned in the average sample. But then if we look at different groups, like the pioneers who are the poorest and the followers who are the richest, again, there's kind of stable differences. Same thing with trends in ties to prior migrants. We would expect that to increase over time as more and more people migrate, more people will be connected. But again, family and friends, the most connected group, is way above everyone else. So basically, this is to say that our pool is definitely changing over time. But then, people are also being selected differently from that pool over time. And this actually you can confirm with kind of more sophisticated models. Now, I move to the final and perhaps the most important question. Why is this happening? Now, when I began, I said that, okay, so I'm going to select on the dependent variable. I'm going to look at these different groups based on configurations of attributes. And my big assumption was that, people who have different configurations of attributes face different opportunity structures. Now, this is a way to test that. If they're really facing different opportunity structures, they should be responding to different conditions in the Mexican-U.S. context. In other words, I'm using the larger context, how the economy in Mexico is doing, how the economy in the U.S. is doing, how other things are changing as an external validity check. If these groups are real and meaningful for migration, I would expect them to be reacting to different conditions. And this is, again, another way of testing if clustering makes sense, if it's meaningful, if it really tells us some new information that we didn't have before. Now, again, in the book, there are different ways of looking at this, but the simplest is asking this question: are different groups responding to different macro-level conditions? Now, what macro-level conditions do we need to consider? There's a lot of things changing in two countries, and we're looking at 45 years. And again, we use the literature here and different theories that have been tested. And a lot of these indicators are actually available through the MIP because Doug Massey has done a lot of the legwork in kind of setting this on. So the neoclassical model tells us that it's about wage differences. So we need to know about how low-skilled wages in the U.S. have been changing, how GDP in Mexico has been changing. The unemployment levels in the two countries are important. Also, border patrol enforcement. There's been a huge change after the 1990s where U.S. has invested more and more in securing the border, and that has made it presumably more costly for migrants to cross. So that should have an effect, according to this neoclassical idea that it's all about the costs and benefits. Now, if you think migration is about the uncertainty, you need to track the economic crises that have happened in Mexico, especially in the 1980s. And one good indicator that has tracked that, and that Doug has used in his paper as well, is inflation in Mexico. So there has been several peso devaluations, and inflation each time has spiked, as have the interest rates. So that's a measure of financial volatility in the country. Now, if you're interested in this cumulative causation idea, if you see migration as this path-dependent process, you need to look at Mexican migration stock in the U.S. and also visa availability. If families want to be unified, there are opportunities for that. We'll use that. Now, the segmented labor markets idea is all about demand, what the U.S. needs. So here I'm looking at change in employment in migrant-heavy sectors like construction, manufacturing. And then the world systems or globalization idea is kind of grander vision of like it's all about the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. As U.S. is funneling more funds and trade to Mexico, more people's lives will be kind of dislocated and they'll be kind of more connected to the U.S. and its institutions, and they'll be more mobile. And then one thing that I didn't talk about is changing fertility in Mexico, which is a huge factor. So I said that all the graphs I'm showing are percentages. If I showed numbers of migrants, the patterns would be the same, but then you would also see this declining numbers of migrants from Mexico over time, especially in the last 10 years. And one reason that people attribute this to is kind of the declining fertility in Mexico. So 30 years ago, average birth rate was around 7, and now I believe it's at the replacement level. So again, that changes family sizes and people available for migration. So these are all the kind of macro level factors that we know from literature that matter. Now, we can take these indicators and actually fit them to a general model of migration where we kind of try to estimate the number of migrants coming to the U.S. And it works, and it's actually what's been done in literature. But what I'm interested in is, okay, we know some of these things matter, but do they matter differently for different groups? And here I look at the pioneers only, the first group, uneducated, poor migrants from poor areas, and I'm regressing the number of pioneers on all these macro level indicators. And three things are important to this. U.S. low-skill wages, the higher the wages, the more migrants join this group. Mexican GDP per capita, negatively related. As Mexico becomes richer, less migrate from this group. And then the border patrol enforcement has a negative effect. So it's all about the costs and benefits of migration as the neoclassical model would lead us to predict. And these three things alone explain 95% of the variation in the number of group 1. And actually, the relationship is quite strong that you can actually see it in the raw data. So here, the white line again shows the pioneers, and the yellow line is the U.S. low-skill wages. And you can see that the lines follow each other closely until the late 1990s, and then there's a divergence, but that's actually when U.S. Border Patrol enforcement has really increased. So these things are really correlated. Now, you might think, of course, but then if we look at the second group, the second group's numbers are not correlated with wages or employment at all. What they respond to is Mexican inflation rate. And again, the Border Patrol enforcement. Again, these two indicators account for 85% or 84% of the variation. The relationship between inflation and the rise of this group is quite clear, even from the raw data. So as I said, late 1970s and 1980s, Mexico experienced 3 economic crises, one after the other. And this actually put a lot of pressure on family budgets, and credit was not available. And actually, a lot of people in the qualitative data, this actually comes out kind of, I think, more convincingly. So some people talk about migration as, I wanted to earn more money, I knew I could go, I went and came back. And for some people, it's all about leave. So our family was in this situation. My father offered he would take care of my wife if I went. So I decided to go. So this kind of family coming together at time of risk, as the theory would predict, seemed consistent with what this group is doing in response to changing economic conditions in Mexico. Now, the third group, and again, I'm saying that if we were to look for a theory to fit this, it would be the new economics model. Now, I'm not trying to overfit theories to cases. I think each of these theories have something to say about what people are doing, but a lot of the literature is about, okay, so which one is right? What I'm trying to say is that, well, they might all be right for different groups if we were looking for that kind of evidence. So the third group, family and friends, Mexican GDP per capita is related, but the most predictive factor is the number of visas available for family reunification. And we can actually see the yellow line here tracks the U.S. permanent residency as given to Mexicans. And as you can see, it's quite constant over time until 1986, when the Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed. So this act did a couple of things. So it increased border enforcement. It also put sanctions on employers who were hiring undocumented migrants. So these were supposed to kind of deter undocumented migration. But it also legalized more than 2 million Mexicans already here. So in a few years, these migrants could petition to bring their family members here. And this is exactly what we're seeing here. The increase in the number of women in the sample is a direct result of ERCA. Now, again, this is more related to the cumulative causation model, where it's not about the economic incentives, but it's about families trying to stay together and using opportunities to do that. Now, the final model. So this is where it gets a little tricky. So the final model, the urbanites. It's the only meaningful thing is that it increases with the U.S. exports to Mexico. Now, if we look at it, there's this is the log of trade between Mexico and the U.S. And there are two kind of important points. In 1986, Mexico entered General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, so it increased trade. And then in 1994, it signed NAFTA. So this meant that it received a lot of foreign direct investment. But then how is this related to organized migrating? So in the previous three cases, it's kind of easy to imagine the mid-level mechanisms of, okay, so the wages are high and people are responding to that in order to increase their income. But what is happening here? I think it's kind of a complicated story, a couple of things. So one is, remember these people are coming from the border region, from the cities. One thing is the saturation of the cities, and with increasing U.S. involvement with the maquiladoras in the border region, increasing economic restructuring, that made skills of some groups basically useless. And there's some evidence for that in certain regions. Ruben Hernandez-Leron, for example, from UCLA, wrote this ethnography in Monterrey, in a city where people literally were losing their jobs and migrating as a result of that. So there's some of that might be going. So the idea of economic disruption pushing people out. But then the other idea is that NAFTA, and this thanks to Doug, NAFTA has actually granted a lot of temporary visas to people who were working in these kind of US-based companies. So these people could come to the US for a period of time. Actually, if you look at the NLP data, many of these migrants are documented. They're not, like at least half of them have documentation coming to the US. So these two things, opportunities in the US for certain groups that are kind of in trade-heavy regions, and then economic dislocation experienced by, again, some people pushing them to move. So these are my kind of two competing ideas. One related theme is the links between internal and international migration. So many of these people living in the cities were once internal migrants. So about a third I can identify in the data were not born in the city that they're living in. So it might be that they're already rootless in the city, and so internal migration is one step to migrating internationally. Now, one alternative hypothesis we can think of, again, related to the geographic concentration of this group, is increasing crime in Mexico, which again concentrates in the border region. Now, this might be, but if it happens much later in my data, after 2006. So the big spike in crime rates in Mexico happened between 2006 and 2012. So I have very few data points in that point. So I kind of doubt that that's accounting for this. But the two things is basically the restructuring idea and the opportunities in the U.S. Again, kind of a surprising case. I don't have a perfect explanation for it. Now, I'm very close to finishing. So what do I try to achieve in this book? So I started out, when I first started this project, it was all about, okay, so describing the diversity of the Mexican-U.S. tree. So we constantly read about the stereotypical Mexican migrants, unskilled, male, and coming to the U.S. to kind of earn better wages. But what I think I find is kind of, this is just one characterization among many possible. And actually, if you look at the recent writings, they're much more educated than the average Mexican. So that's one thing. The other thing is that different reasons actually are mobilizing different groups. In other words, there are different logics underlying the migration of these people. For some of them, it's a reaction to the opportunities in the U.S. And for others, it's about escaping the dire conditions in Mexico and dealing with the situation as a family. And for others, it's just a way of keeping the families together and being in the same place. So whatever the reason is, they're kind of structurally induced. So the overall structure determines what parts of people's lives will be salient to them at that point. So and then when we talk about like different theories of migration, and this is maybe a general theme in social science when we're trying to kind of differentiate between different theories, we need to remember that these theories are all conditional statements. When we put them all in the regression, that we kind of implicitly assume that they have to work for everyone in the same way. But then they're conditional. That means that they're going to work under certain circumstances for certain groups of people that are being exposed to those circumstances. So this is just one kind of way of getting at that kind of causal heterogeneity. And it gives us an opportunity not to pit theories against each other, but actually try to understand when each one works. And people always ask me about policy. I don't think I have a good answer for it. But one theme that comes out of this is, and Doug has written about this a lot, so a lot of immigration policy is centered around these kind of fixing the costs and benefits of migration and presuming that people will respond to that. Well, some groups might. Maybe the first group and the last group are responding to opportunities in the U.S. But then for some groups, like the second group facing a crisis, the situation might be so dire that they'll come regardless of our difficulties. And actually, if we look at the differences between these groups, the second group, who's migrating at the time of an economic crisis, will try the hardest across the border, meaning that multiple tries, and will take the lowest wages compared to all other three groups. So that tells you something about, like, deterrence policies might not work. And for some people, it's about family, keeping the family together. It's not economic at all. And for those people, the economic incentives might work. So let's stop here. Thank you for listening.